A man awoke to the sound of lapping waves, but the water was as black as the void, and the air was thick with shadows. He stumbled to his feet on the rocky shore, disorientated. A cold mist curled around him, and in the distance he saw the outline of a dock, barely visible through the fog. A small boat approached, cutting through the dark waters with a silence that chilled his bones. A cloaked figure stood at the helm, a hood obscuring their face. The boat stopped at the dock, and the figure stepped out, boots crunching on the pebbles. The air grew colder.
Where would you like to go?
The ferryman's voice was hollow, echoing like a distant whisper. The man clutched his head, trying to piece together memories that slipped through his fingers like sand. He remembered life, a life he desperately wanted back, though the reasons were blurred in his mind. I want to go back to the living. The ferryman tilted his head slightly, shadows shifting beneath the hood.
The fare is steep, but it can be paid. Or you may explore the lands of the dead. That journey is free.
The man's heart quickened, desperation welling up. He knew that whatever awaited in the land of the dead, it would be nothing compared to the ache for life that throbbed inside him. I don't care what it costs. I have to live again. The ferryman's laugh was a low, rattling sound that sent a shiver through the man.
And how will you pay, I wonder?
The ferryman's hand emerged from the cloak, bony fingers reaching out.
Do you have any coins?
The man patted his pockets, empty and worn. He looked back at the ferryman, panic rising. I have nothing. Please, there must be another way.
But the coin is a metaphor. You see, I ask you this. You have 5 to give, but I only need 1. What will it be?
The riddle gnawed at the man, tugging at something in the back of his mind. He thought of his senses, the 5 ways he experienced the world. The ferryman's words turned over in his mind like a bitter puzzle. After a moment that felt like an eternity, realization struck him. You want one of my senses? The man ventured, his voice cracking. The ferryman's smile was barely a sliver of pale teeth in the shadows of his hood.
Indeed. Choose wisely.
The man's stomach twisted with dread, but he made his decision. Take taste. I can live without that. A swift movement. The ferryman produced a rusted blade from his cloak, its edge glinting in the dim light. He held it out for the man, a silent demand. The man took the knife, his hand shaking as he brought the blade to his tongue. Tears blurred his vision as he cut, the pain searing through his head. He dropped the bloodied piece of flesh into the ferryman's waiting hand. The ferryman pressed the severed tongue against his own mouth, and to the man's horror, it merged into his face. When the ferryman next spoke, it was in the man's own voice, the tone cruel and mocking. I will take you as close to home as I can. The ferryman gestured to the boat, and the man climbed in, clutching his bleeding mouth. The boat moved without a sound, gliding over black water. As the darkness thinned, A distant shape grew closer. A hospital room, bright and sterile, filled with the muffled sounds of life. The world dissolved into light, and the man's consciousness slipped away. He awoke in a new body, small and frail, cradled in a nurse's arms, a newborn, crying out, but unable to form a sound. Years passed, and the child grew into a boy. He had no tongue, no words, and the taste of food was nothing but a memory. A yearning lingered, pulling him toward a past life that haunted his dreams. When he was old enough, he ran away, driven by a need he couldn't explain. He sought her, the woman whose face he could barely remember, but whose presence clung to his soul like a scar. He found her at last, standing on a sunny street, her hair catching the light, just as it had in those hazy, half-remembered days. She was with a man, a stranger, but the sight of her brought a flood of emotions that he couldn't contain. He fell to his knees, tears streaming down his face, unable to speak the words that tore at his chest. Desperately, he fumbled with a notepad and pencil, his hands shaking as he scrawled a message in jagged, frantic lines. I love you. I'm sorry. I came back for you. She took the notepad, her brow furrowed, but all she saw was a young boy, wild-eyed and broken, his handwriting barely legible. Her face softened, but there was only pity in her eyes as she handed the pad back. Please go home, she said softly, her hand slipping into her new husband's. She turned away, leaving the boy on the pavement, his silent sobs swallowed by the wind. He watched her go, a pain deeper than any he had known before clawing at his chest. He reached for the place where his tongue had been, the empty space, a reminder of the price he had paid. The ferryman's voice echoed in his mind, that hollow, mocking tone. I will take you as close to home as I can. And the boy understood, as he lay crumpled on the cold ground, that he had came back not to live, but to suffer the ghost of a life lost, forever silent and out of reach. Enjoy the vibe? Then please like, comment, and subscribe.